why do people rebel? I think people don't rebel because they believe they are stronger, but because there comes a point when living in fear becomes more painful than fighting. It's when years of unfairness or the loss of freedom or the betrayal of those who are in power has become too much to bear. But why do ordinary people fight battles they know they can't win? I used to think about this often every time I would hear about a strike, or about when citizens march through the streets, or simply people standing up against those who are in power, despite knowing that they can never have that much power. Not because I admired their courage, but because I couldn't understand the logic behind it. Why would they fight? What was the point? Because if you think about it, the government or the authority has police, military, and the rule of law. Even a corporation has money, lawyers, and a lot of public influence. A king has a little army. An ordinary citizen like you and me has almost nothing. Most of us avoid fights in our daily life. We hesitate to argue with our boss, or we always stay quiet just to avoid conflict. We worry like what will people think about us, or how does that affects us. So how does that same ordinary person one day decides that he will stand in front of an army or a government or an empire? At the very first glance, it seems irrational. But maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. The question is not only why people rebel, the question is what has to happen before an ordinary person decides to disobey and rebel. I think fear is the greatest power of an empire. Every system of power, whether it's a king, an empire, a corporation, or even the government, has one thing in common. It wants to convince the people that resistance is hopeless. At first glance, that belief seems reasonable. I mean, those who have power or those who have more money, they command more influence over stronger institutions and often the ability to punish anyone who challenges them. And an ordinary person doesn't really fear losing a debate with authority because they risk losing their livelihood, their freedom, their reputation, or even their life. This isn't the kind of fear you will feel while watching a horror movie because it's the kind of fear you would feel when you're standing in front of a tiger or a lion because your survival depends on it. And that's exactly why authority doesn't need to defeat every individual. They just have to convince a few or the majority that fighting back is irrational, and the rest of them will automatically get convinced. Because the greatest weapon of those in power isn't really violence, it's the belief that they are unbeatable. That belief is reinforced almost every day through many institutions, stories people tell each other, and the simple observation that those who resisted have lost. And I think over time, people then stop asking that can things improve or can they change? Instead, they begin asking, what's the point? And I think that's when obedience becomes voluntary. Not because people agree with those in power, but because they believe resistance is impossible now. So, another question very naturally arises. Before asking why ordinary people rebel, we should first ask why they obey authority in the first place. And I remember I was reading a book and it described that in the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted one of the most famous yet very controversial experiments in psychology. In his experiment, participants believed that they were giving painful electric shocks to another person whenever they answered a question incorrectly. Many became very distressed and they wanted to stop. Yet a surprisingly high number continued simply because someone in authority told them to do so. And in that experiment, Milgram wasn't trying to prove that people are inherently evil. He was revealing something far more unsettling, that authority has an extraordinary psychological pull, and any normal individual can get affected by it. We don't need a lab to see this. Obedience is injected in our daily lives. And from the very beginning, if we think of our childhood, we are simply taught to listen to our parents, our teachers, our coaches, and then later on, our bosses. Most of the time, that's necessary because society cannot function if everybody just ignored every rule or questioned every instruction. But I think somewhere along the line, many of us stopped asking like whether authority is right or not and begin assuming that authority should be followed. And I think that is a very dangerous idea because growing up, I noticed this everywhere, especially in high competitive societies like India, where education, like IITs, is often the path to a better life. Discipline and following systems is rewarded while questioning them is punished. And that system has been placed for a long time. And I think it's because when survival and financial security becomes your priority, challenging authority feels like a very risky move. Whether in a classroom, at work, or in society in general, people learn that staying quiet is very much safer than speaking up. And over time, obedience becomes the default emotion. We follow instructions, avoid fights, and hesitate to question those above us, not because we agree with them, but because questioning that authority has consequences. And yet, despite all of this, history keeps producing ordinary people who have refused to obey and led a revolution. Workers go on strike, citizens march across the street, and people stand before armies, governments, and empires, even though they know that they are hopelessly outmatched. If obedience comes so naturally, then what has to happen before an ordinary person decides to disobey? And I think it comes to an idea of an illusion. So every person has two sets of beliefs. The first one is what they truly believe privately, their opinions, their frustrations, and the values they hold. The second is what they show publicly, the opinions they are comfortable expressing around others. These two are not always the same. Because think about everyday life. You might disagree with a decision at your college, dislike a rule, or have an opinion that might goes against others, and you can get outcast for it. But when everyone around you seems to support an opinion, staying silent feels very easy simply because you are not creating a conflict. Not necessarily because you challenge your beliefs, but because expressing them has a cost. You might be judged, isolated, rejected, or feel like you are fighting a battle you cannot win. Psychologist Timur Kuran has described this idea as preference falsification, the act of hiding your true beliefs and presenting a different opinion because of social pressure. The result is something very fascinating. A society can look very united than it actually is. Everyone looks around and see agreement. Everyone thinks, maybe I'm the only one who feels this way. But the reality might be completely different. Because the person who's sitting next to you is having the same doubts, frustrations, or even concerns. But they are also staying quiet because they believe everyone has accepted their situation. This creates an illusion. An authority can appear stronger than it really is because people confuse this illusion with support. A ruler may believe that they have the absolute loyalty of millions of followers, or a company may believe that all their employees are satisfied. A system in place may believe that people accept the way things are, but underneath the surface, dissatisfaction continues to grow. And I think this is why revolutions happen very suddenly. From the outside, it looks like people changed overnight, but they didn't. The anger, the frustration, it was always there. The desire to change was always there. What really happened was that people finally realized that they are not the only one who are facing this issue, that they are not alone. And I think this is where a small event can become a big turning point. It could be a very small thing, like one person speaking out, or one protest, one refusal to obey a law, one moment where someone decides that it is not worth to stay silent and the things are not acceptable. That person does not win immediately and they do not immediately defeat authority, but they break the most powerful illusion of power, that everyone is obedient and that everyone is okay with the way things are. Once people see that others are standing up, the fear that had kept them silent just simply fades away. But this raises another question. If a lot of people, let's say millions of people, are frustrated, afraid, and want to change, why does one person decides to stand up? And exactly when? I think because the first person who rebels is necessarily not the strongest one. They are simply the first person who decides that the cost of staying silent has become greater than the cost of resistance. History has given us many examples of this. During the British rule in India, before the independence, millions of people were under the British rule, and they had enormous military, economic, and political power at that time. To go against the British Empire for an ordinary person seemed like an impossible challenge, and it was because the British had an army, they controlled institutions and resources, and yet people began to challenge that power. Mahatma Gandhi understood something important about resistance. He understood that the goal is to not physically defeat a stronger empire or the British Empire. The goal was to simply challenge a belief. And that belief was that stronger opponent is invincible, such as the British Empire. So Gandhi and thousands of Indians simply marched to a coast to make salt, openly challenging a British law. But making salt does not defeat an empire. It only represents a symbolic point that an empire can be challenged. It showed ordinary people that an empire could be challenged. It transformed invisible anger into visible resistance. And once people saw that resistance was possible, the fear that had kept them silent began to weaken. Because as we have just learned, power is not something which you maintain by weapons. It is maintained by a belief that challenging the authority is impossible. The first person who breaks this illusion may be very weak and they may still lose, but they do something far more important. They prove that this fearful opponent can be challenged, and that one person breaks that silence. And once that other person breaks that silence, others also start to realize that maybe I was never alone and there are other people who are facing the same issue. So, coming back to the original question, why do people rebel? After everything we have discussed, maybe the answer is not simple, like having more courage, because having courage alone does not explain it. Millions of people live under unfair conditions every day throughout the world, and millions of them experience frustration, injustice, and disappointment every day. Yet, most of them continue to obey, and not because they are weak or not very connected or are not very united, but because they believe resistance is impossible and that there is no other way and this is the way things are. They have accepted that as a reality. They believe that people around them have accepted the situation and this is what it is. They believe that they are the only ones who are feeling this way, and that belief is what keeps power alive. Because authority is strongest when people feel isolated. If they come together, they will share their opinion, and that is not good for the authority. A king does not rule only because he has an army. They have survived because millions of ordinary people continue to believe that challenging them is literally pointless. But history has shown us otherwise, that the most powerful systems or the most powerful empires have always depended on something very fragile, the obedience of normal people and the illusion of power. And when that obedience started to disappear, even the strongest powers were defeated. A revolution does not begin when people stop being afraid. It begins when people realize that everyone else is afraid too, and they are not alone. The person who stands up first is not necessarily the strongest. They are simply the first person who is willing to break the silence. And when others see that people are standing up, they no longer see an impossible battle. They see a possibility that maybe they were never powerless, or maybe they were only convinced that they were powerless. Because throughout history, power has always looked permanent until the moment ordinary people decide that it isn't.